author of The Kurds. Zachary Karabell moderates this hour-long talk.
My name is Zachary Karabell. I will be your moderator. Apparently that's why I'm wearing a suit. I seem to be the only person in Southern California doing that. I am from New York. I've written widely about the Middle East, or at least somewhat widely, hopefully deeply as well. I've written a book on the building of the Suez Canal called Parting the Desert, and a book that will be published in about 6 months called Peace Be Upon You, The Story of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish Coexistence, which oddly enough is about Muslim, Christian, and Jewish coexistence. Our panel today is called Under a Crescent Moon, The Changing Shape of the Middle East. We have 4 individuals who have all written about the Middle East in one form or another. And clearly this is a topic that is on everyone's mind and on everyone's lips. It is a part of the world that is fraught with conflict, suffused with tension, and which very few people in either the Middle East or the West view without a degree of fear. That, of course, is not the whole story of this part of the world, nor is it nearly the whole story of Islam in its glory that spreads across multiple continents and more than 1.3 billion people. But it is the elements of this story that we all focus on and increasingly focus on. Each of the individuals here have examined an element of this or another, and we will talk today about various elements, including the more pressing issue of today, which is U.S. policy toward Iran, and why it is that is one of the more pressing issues of the day, and that's something that we need to ask as well as focus on, and each of the panelists will have their own perspective on that. I'm going to introduce each one in the order in which they're going to speak. We will then listen to each for about 5 to 7 minutes. At the 7-minute mark, I will start gesticulating wildly because there's no way to do it otherwise. So if I seem to be in discomfort, it's because I am. And then we will have some discussion amongst the panelists. Hopefully that will arrive organically out of the discussion. And if there is time, we will have some audience questions. There are 2 microphones, and you'll have to make the long walk forward in order to do that. Ilan Berman, who's directly to my left, but only in geography, is the author of, I kid you not, is the author of Tehran Rising, Iran's Challenge to the United States. Ilan is a vice president for policy at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, for the Middle East Quarterly, the Jerusalem Post. He has a master's in international affairs from American University, and he has been a more prominent voice of late about the issue of Iran and U.S. policy toward it. Next will be Mark Bowden, who's on the far left, and that really is only in geography. Mark, many of you will know, was a longtime correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, has written a number of books, including a great book on baseball many years ago, a book called Killing Pablo, about the hunt for the Colombian drug lord Pablo Escobar, and of course Black Hawk Down, his best-selling book about the U.S. Marines in Somalia, and the movie that was made about it. His recent book is Guests of the Ayatollah, The First Battle in America's War with Militant Islam, which has just been published by Grove Atlantic. Mark is also a contributing editor or correspondent for the Atlantic Monthly. Next is Reza Aslan. I was going to wear what Reza wore, but didn't. Reza has become one of the more eloquent and visible voices on multiple TV shows, the comedy station, the Colbert Report. Everybody who meets him in the author green room wants to know how to get on the Colbert Report. They don't really care about talking about Islam or the West. Reza is the author of No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, which I think just came out in paperback. It's been published in multiple countries, been lauded everywhere from England to India to the United States, and deservedly so. Reza is also soon to be a fellow at the USC Center for Public Diplomacy. That begins in the fall. He assures me that that will begin in the fall, assuming this panel goes well. And he has a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard, as well as an MFA from the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. He is also a PhD candidate at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And finally, Kevin McKiernan, who is the author of The Kurds, A People in Search of Their Homeland. Kevin is a journalist and filmmaker for many years. He's both written and reported from Nicaragua to Iraq to West Africa. He's written for Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, and his reported segments have appeared on ABC, CBS, and a variety of television stations. So with that and with these themes in mind, we will begin with Ilan Berman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Zachary. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here because I get the opportunity to be the first panelist. I can really frame the way this discussion goes. So, stay put, stay tuned.
So you think.
So I think. So what I thought I would do would be to explain the evolutionary process, at least in my thinking when I wrote my book, because my book is about Iran. And it's also about U.S. foreign policy towards Iran in the context of someone who is not an avowed Iran expert. I am a product of Soviet times. My family's from the Soviet Union, and I come at the Middle East by way of Soviet studies, by way of Russia. The way I landed on the topic of Iran is that in my day-to-day work at the think tank where I work, the American Foreign Policy Council, I spent a lot of time tracking transnational threats. And in the months and years after September 11th, no matter where I looked, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, the Persian Gulf, the Levant, what was remarkable was the degree to which Iran was making new political, economic, and even military inroads. And the aggregate picture that emerged was much broader than what you see in the paper today. In the paper today, we discuss just one aspect of that. That's the nuclear issue. But the aggregate challenge from Iran to the United States is much broader. It involves a political agenda that encompasses activity in Iraq, activity in Central Asia, activity in the Caucasus, deep involvement with less than savory elements in places like Lebanon and the Palestinian territories. And that has all sorts of implications for American policymakers. So if you were to take a bird's eye view of what I tried to do with my book, it would be to hammer home the message that we're asking the wrong questions about Iran. Right now, we're very focused, and deservedly so, on the nuclear issue. It's consumed us for the last 3 years diplomatically, and now it's going to consume us in the Security Council context, because Iran is quite clearly hurtling headlong towards nuclear status. We can debate whether or not it has a right to acquire nuclear weapons. We can have a debate about whether or not it wants to acquire nuclear weapons. What's quite clear, though, is that in Iran, in Tehran, there's been a strategic decision made in favor of nuclearization. And the world is now beginning to grapple with that. But the argument that I would make is that this is the wrong question. This is the wrong question to be asking. And the UN is the wrong forum in which to adjudicate it. Because the challenge from Iran is far broader than simply the nuclear question. The challenge from Iran encompasses Iran's activities in Iraq, Iran's attempts to mold the security environment in the Persian Gulf to its liking over the last 3 years, and remarkably to do so despite the fact that there has been an unprecedented infusion of U.S. military personnel, U.S. technology, U.S. capital into that region. Iran's efforts to create an anti-Western coalition in the new states of the post-Soviet space, Central Asia and the Caucasus. And what that means, what that broad strategic agenda means for the United States. The nuclear issue is only one aspect of that. You take it away, there will still be involvement by Iran in funding organizations, destabilized organizations such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So when we're discussing Iran, I think context is everything. Iran is not a 20th century invention like many of its neighbors. Iran is a long civilizational has a long civilizational impulse, and it is now, in the context of the war on terror, beginning to realize it. And this is, I think, something that we're beginning to see more and more of in the papers. Certainly over the last 6 months, we've had a sea change in the way the United States government begins to think about Iran. Before, we were talking about Iran solely in the context of whether or not they're in compliance with international arms control agreements. such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now we are having a broader discussion, and one that I think we should be having, about the character of the Iranian regime itself and what it means that this regime is rising rapidly, and how does that affect what the U.S. is attempting to do in the Middle East. And maybe because I'm somewhat invested in this topic, my argument here is that Iran is the big one. This is the big issue that's coming down the pike in the next couple of years, because it implicates so many of the things that the U.S. is trying to do. Create stability in Iraq is one. Democratization as a larger project is another. Counterterrorism is a third. But the degree to which we can manage and confront Iran's ambitions, not only on the nuclear front, but in terms of Iran's settled decision to be the region's sole standing superpower in the aftermath of the fall of Saddam Hussein, is going to dictate all sorts of things for our Middle East policy moving forward. And if nothing else, my book is two. It's an assessment of this challenge, and it's an effort to try to cobble together some of the strains that are floating around in Washington, where I work and my colleagues work, to try to forge a coherent strategy towards Iran. One that doesn't gravitate to the two polar extremes that you see now in the papers. You see diplomacy or military action. And this, quite frankly, is inelegant. It's not the proper solution. It's a failure of imagination. There are many things that we can do, from economic to political to covert, to change and transform this issue in a way that benefits not only us, but also the people of Iran. The fact that we're not doing it is, frankly, a failure of imagination and a failure of incentive on our part. And it's something that really should be addressed in short order. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Bowden, you've written a book that brings us back to the antecedents, or some of the origins of the current relationship and incredibly fraught relationship between the United States and Iran, namely the taking of the hostages at the U.S. Embassy in 1979. So with that, Mark Bowden.
Well, one of the hazards of writing true stories is that you are sometimes mistaken for an expert on the subject matter that you've just written about. When I wrote the book Black Hawk Down, which is about a battle, I remember sometimes talking to military audiences and being asked questions about the ordnance package that had been sent to Somalia, whether they should have had, Bradley armored vehicles as part of the ordnance package. And I had to explain to the questioner, I've never been in the military. I have no experience with military. I don't even know what a Bradley armored vehicle looks like. I think you have to at least know that to have an opinion on the subject. I choose stories that interest me actually first and foremost from a dramatic point of view. And my interest in the Iranian hostage crisis initially was the experience of captivity. 52 Americans were held hostage for 15 months in Tehran, and I was compelled, I think, more than anything, to try to understand what they had been through and what that experience was like, how they had coped with it. But of course, when you start down that road, you end up, trying to understand how and why things happened the way they did. And as I worked on this story, Guests of the Ayatollah, it became more clear to me, what a pivotal moment in modern history the takeover of the American embassy was. I think at the time, in 1979 and 1980, it was perceived by most Americans as a kind of a bizarre episode, almost like an aberration. We were in the middle of the Cold War. The world was essentially wrestling with the question, as it had been for 20 or 30 years, of whether the system that would dominate the earth would be a democratic capitalist system, or whether it was going to be a socialist or communist system. So suddenly this theocratic revolution, which was like a throwback to the 7th or 8th century, just seemed really peculiar. And I don't think that there was a great deal of understanding, certainly in the press here in the United States, for the most part, about the motivations and the ideals of the young Iranians who attacked the American embassy and and took it. I went back in researching Guest of the Ayatollah and looked at, in addition to the print media's coverage of the event, hours and hours of the television reporting that took place. At the Carter Center in Annapolis, they have hundreds of hours of videotape of the old TV broadcasts during that period. And those of you who are as old as I am can remember how it transfixed the country, the 15 months of that crisis, and how Walter Cronkite would open the broadcast with the number of the day that the hostages had been held. But one of the things that wasn't really there in that reporting, for the most part, was an explanation of why this was happening. There was, I think, very little understanding, and as a result, the perception I think that most Americans got was that there was just this kind of insane country over there, where people were calling the United States the Great Satan for no appreciable reason. And I think, one of the things that I set out to do when I wrote this book, as I did when I wrote Black Hawk Down, was to try to reach a better understanding of how and why this happened from an Iranian standpoint. It's always tricky to identify moments in history that are turning points or pivotal, but I think that certainly in light of what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years after September 11th, the United States woke up definitely to the understanding that we are engaged in a contest with Islamist fundamentalism all over the world. And I think that to understand what's going on in this inaptly named war on terror, it's very helpful to get a grip on what happened in Tehran in 1979, why the students felt compelled to do what they did, and what the upshot of it was both in Iran and around the world. So that's what I set out to do in this book, and so to the extent that that work can give me some insight into the rest of what we're talking about here, I'm happy to chip in my 2 cents.
Before we go on, Mark, when you began the research on this, which I imagine would have been at least 3 or 4 years ago.
5. Yeah.
Did you have a sense that this was that we would be in the current moment that we're in, or were you?
No, no, I didn't. In fact, when I told my publisher Morgan Entrican that this was the next book I wanted to do, he was not completely convinced that this was a good way to spend my time. This is in the early summer of 2001. After the 9/11 attacks, I think he appreciated better the significance of this event. I think that I certainly didn't know that Iran was going to be on the front pages of newspapers today, but I did probably, from the reporting that I've done in the Middle East, have a better sense at that point, I think, than most Americans, that we were headed on a sort of collision course in the world with the traditional cultures of Islam. And I knew that Iran was the center of this. That was my understanding of it, that was the big, as Ilan has said, that Iran is the major player in the fundamentalist Islamist political movement around the world.
This is a sad but true lesson for all authors, particularly on this part of the world, that there's an inverse correlation between what is good for the world and what is good for our books. So often when this part of the world is at its worst, these kind of books get the most attention. I think all of us probably would wish that neither of those things were the case, but it often is. Reza, you've written recently, or I think perhaps said in a radio interview, that 26 years of U.S. policy toward Iran has only strengthened the iron grip of the clerical regime and accelerated the country's weapons program. In your book, No God But God, you look at the evolution of Islam through a much more neutral and less heated lens, and also talk about the need perhaps for a reformation within Islam. I wonder if you can comment a bit on all of that.
Sure. Well, I guess since we're on the topic of Iran, we'll stay there for a little bit. I happen to be an Iran expert, actually. So not least because I'm from Iran. There's no question that the invasion of Iraq has completely reshaped the power dynamics of that region. Iran is now, I think, unquestionably the dominant political force in the Gulf. Its nearest enemies, Saddam Hussein and the Taliban, are gone. It has used the withdrawal of Syria from Lebanon to fill the power vacuum left behind there through its ties with Hezbollah. It has taken advantage of Western cuts in funding for the new Palestinian Authority to start pouring money to Hamas in order to strengthen its ties there, and thereby essentially purchase itself a ready-made militia just in case Israel makes good on its threat for a preemptive attack. It has its forces embedded fairly deeply within Iraq. It's got probably, of all of Iraq's neighbors, the closest ties to that government, both trade-wise and with regard to the political situation there. Not to mention, of course, it has a very strong role to play in some of the militias in Iraq, particularly that of Muqtada al-Sadr. Meanwhile, record oil prices and this booming trade that Iran has with India and with China and with Russia has made it somewhat, well, I wouldn't say impervious, but it certainly has lessened some of the consequences of this threat of further sanctions. And I think all of this explains this incredible strength that Iran has been showing over the past 3 or 4 years. Explains the fantasy that some people within the administration have, that somehow there's a military solution to this problem, that if we can just rain some bombs on Iran, then the problem will go away. But the problem will not go away, not least because we helped create that problem in some ways. We can go back and forth certainly in our discussions, and I'm sure some of the questions that people have about what to do about Iran, but we have to understand that Iran's interests in the regions, while perhaps conflicting with U.S. interests in the regions, are just as legitimate as ours, and they have to be recognized. And as long as we continue this policy over the last almost 3 decades now, of sanctioning and isolating and containing Iran in hopes of bringing down the clerical regime, a policy that I can't imagine anyone would agree has done any good in that country at all, has created anything even remotely like the regime change that we are hoping for. Until we sort of discard that policy and start thinking anew, not just about how to deal with Iran, but about what Iran means to this region, then I think we're going to remain in this impasse for quite some time. Now, I am one of the many people who talk about the option of dialogue and diplomacy with Iran, and I mean direct diplomacy with Iran. Iran has no interest in speaking to anyone except the United States. There's nothing that the Europeans could offer them. They feel as though their trade relations with China and Russia are enough so that if the U.S. continues its stance, it could more or less deal with that. But I think Iran is very much interested in the possibility of dialogue. And the problem is, of course, is when you have this 27-year chasm, one that was built in a very striking manner, as Mark was mentioning, by the Iran hostage crisis that still has a very large hold on the imaginations not just of Americans but Iranians. You need a bridge. And fortunately, we have a bridge. And that bridge is Iraq. The fact of the matter is that Iran has much more to win or lose by what happens in Iraq than the United States does. If things get to the point where we just want to abandon Iraq, we can just leave. Iran cannot. And I think that the security situation there is something that both the U.S. and Iran have in common. And it does offer, I think, and it has offered in the past, an opportunity to come to the table and at least begin the process of dialogue that could then lead to other issues. There's one last thing I just kind of want to emphasize here, and it goes back to my book and a lot of the things that I write about and talk about, and it's this encouragement that I want to give everyone to start thinking about these issues not just from an American perspective, and not just from an outside perspective, but start thinking about it from a more internal perspective. In the case of Iran, for example, I think that there is this tendency to see Iran as having shifted to the right, this hardline and, quite frankly, insane president who is making these, ridiculous comments. It gives this illusion that there's some kind of monolithic power structure in Iran, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Iran has never, ever been more fractured, politically speaking, than it is today. There are 4 very powerful factions vying with each other in Iran for control. The first, of course, is led by the president, Ahmadinejad, who, while he himself has absolutely no power in that country at all. The president of Iran is a total impotent office. He makes no foreign policy or domestic policy decisions whatsoever. All of those decisions are made by the clerical regime, the supreme leader, who represents a completely second faction in the policies, a much more pragmatic, clerical, conservative position. And then, of course, we have the position most clearly defined by men like Rafsanjani, who are still within the clerical system but have a much more open and much more business-minded, much more technocrat focus. And then we have the various reform-minded groups who themselves are scattered and fractured into different political factions and what have you. So that simple knowledge that Iran, while being at a point where it is more powerful than it has been in decades, is also at a place where it is more fractured. There are more political and religious schisms in that country than there have ever been, should give us an opportunity to better formulate a policy that encourages not just a peaceful solution to this nuclear impasse, but also gives us a better insight into how to deal with Iran instead of as a pariah nation that we've sort of been dealing with for 27 years and to our own detriment.
Reza, do you think there could be a reformation in Iran that would leave a reformed theocracy which would allow a greater open warp and woof of society, much the way there's been a reformed China?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very good point. When I and other religious scholars talk about the Islamic Reformation, which, by the way, we're not waiting for. It's been underway for about a century now. We're living in the midst of it, and the fact that we don't know about it doesn't make it any less true. I doubt that very few people, say, in Africa in the 16th century understood that there was a cataclysmic reformation taking place in Eastern Europe, or in Western Europe, I'm sorry. But this process of reformation, whose principle is this argument over who has the authority to define faith, whether that authority rests in the hands of institutions or whether it rests in the hands of individuals, has in many ways its epicenter in Iran. Because in that sense, something has happened in Iran that has not happened anywhere else in the Muslim world, and that is that the religious leaders are also the political leaders. There's no other country in the world, in the Muslim world, in which that is the case. And so not only have the religious institutions failed to provide a religious message for the Iranian Muslim community, but they've also failed in a political way, so that their failure is very much at the forefront of everyone's mind, and that has created this backlash against the institution of Islam, which, by the way, we're seeing all over the Muslim world, in which that sense of individualism and that the desire to look for alternative sources of authority, particularly interpretive authority, has really begun to take root. And more importantly, because, of course, there's a political element to this as well, I think the most exciting innovations and experiments taking place with this concept of Islamic government and what that means. How do you frame a modern democratic state dedicated to all of the principles that are required of a democracy, but one that is founded upon an Islamic moral framework? How do you reconcile those ideas and those values? How do you create that kind of state? All of that is happening, I think, most interestingly, most excitingly, and most innovatively in Iran.
Kevin McKiernan, we've been talking a lot about Iran and the view from Tehran with, I'm sure, an embedded and implied reference to the view from Baghdad and the view from Jerusalem about conflicts and increasing antagonism between parts of the Middle East and the West and parts of Islam and the West. And yet you have spent so much time in places like Kirkuk and Mosul amongst the Kurds, have, I'm sure, a very different perspective about what this relationship is.
Well, I guess I'm last, but the Kurds certainly are not least, although they have been for many years. And when I first met them, I backed into the story in 1991 at the end of the Kuwait War when Saddam Hussein's troops drove some 1.5 million Kurds into the mountains. We know that so many were driven to Turkey. Actually, the majority were driven to Iran. Iran opened its doors. And about 1 million went there, and I went to Iran first, and then later found myself sneaking into Turkey and Iraq and finding that there were Kurds elsewhere, and named my book, The Kurds, a People in Search of Their Homeland, because despite the fact that they're the largest ethnic minority in the world, they've never had their own homeland. And especially in the last century, there has been a movement toward that, principally at the end of World War I when Wilson and others began to speak the language of self-determination, and the Kurds were promised in Europe with a treaty that they would have a homeland. And those hopes were dashed with the rise of modern Turkey and so forth. So I kind of backed into this story. I had covered stories in different parts of the world and went there not primarily as a reporter the first time, but to bring over some relief shipments from a Santa Barbara, California organization called Direct Relief International. And Direct Relief had a good relationship with Iran, one of the few American relief agencies that did, because it had assisted in the 1989 earthquake. In addition to that, I had an Irish passport, and it made it easier at that time because of the frosty relations between the countries to go. So I went there, and I became fascinated not only because of the size of a group of people who were not recognized. Kuwait has 400,000 or 500,000 people, and fleets of Mercedes-Benzes with flags draw up to the United Nations. And here was a group that went back thousands of years, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years, that had no homeland and was deeply divided. And I began trying to find out the source of some of those divisions. I had begun in the 70s as a radio reporter for this new program called All Things Considered that was just starting out. And they let me wander around in the Midwest covering the police Indian gunfights, especially the FBI and American Indians in South Dakota, places like Wounded Knee. Well, by the time of the 90s, when I encountered the Kurds, I began to see some great similarities in terms of land and language and religion and a search for identity that I had seen as a young reporter covering American Indians. And I began wondering what exactly it was that people were willing to die for, which of these things, your land, your language, your religion, and so forth. And I began these journeys into the Kurdistans in Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Iraq, and watched and have been privileged to see this arc from the time that I slept in the tents with refugees in 91 to today, where in the very center, in the corridors of power in Baghdad in the Green Zone, the president of Iraq is a Kurd, which for anyone who is Kurdish is absolutely a phenomenal journey and arc. And I've seen a little bit of that. But in terms of America's relationships, I think the Kurds believe, and they may be right even from Washington's point of view, that they're America's best friend, most reliable friend in Iraq. And with so much loss and so many losers in this war, the Kurds feel, and they were for the war for this reason, that they have moved toward independence. They're not there yet, but the war has advanced that cause, and they were very pro-war. As a reporter who's covered a lot of wars, I've never met one that I liked. But I was covering the Kurds, and they were very much for the war. They had genocide visited upon them the way American Indians had. They had so much repression, so much loss, and this was their chance to sit on Uncle Sam's knee, if you will, and to be a winner for a change. They had been betrayed by the United States and the West so many times in the past. They decided to take another chance, and what caught my attention as a reporter was that Donald Rumsfeld called Kurdish leaders into the Pentagon only a few weeks after 9/11. This is 2001, and said, "Oh, remember when you were gassed in 1988? Well, we're going to get some justification for you." And he tipped them off to the war only a few weeks after 9/11. As a reporter, that caught my attention, and I began then to investigate how they fit into this puzzle. And so that's pretty much the story of my journeys to these different Kurdistans. I think certainly the Kurds will declare independence, but only if there is a regional war. That prospect, unfortunately, seems to be becoming more likely. A regional war in which the big powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and others are somehow involved. That is, if something isn't done to stop or slow down the train as it exists now. So that's pretty much my understanding. I guess I would only add that one of the more amazing things in terms of the 9/11 fix that we continue to be in, the war in perpetuity that we continue to fight and perhaps will in our grandchildren's day, is that there was a chance at a certain time in the north of Iraq for the United States to act very decisively against al-Qaeda-linked camps that were well known, that were performing suicide missions against the Kurds, and the U.S. ignored and rejected Kurdish advice going back a couple of years before the U.S. invasion to attack those camps because, and this was a case, in my mind at least, of national security being trumped by the domestic politics of keeping the eye on Saddam Hussein. By the time those camps in northern Iraq were attacked, most of the people were able to slip across the border into Iran, and from what intelligence sources say, they've come back now and are fighting under other names, having survived the war on the other side of the border. So it's an interesting role that the Kurds play today. They would very much like to have an alliance like the American-Israel alliance. They would very much like to be a second Israel in the Middle East. A few years back, one of the Kurdish leaders even offered to make Kurdistan the 51st American state. So you see, in their perception at least, they are very much like Americans, and at this point at least, it's the safest part of Iraq to travel in. There has not been a single American soldier who's been killed in the north. This may change, but at this point, that's the situation.
Yes, but would they be a red state or a blue state?
They would definitely be a red state. The Kurds had very clear favorites in the last election. They didn't like John Kerry. They do like George Bush, and they wanted him to win. They were very defensive about criticisms over Abu Ghraib. One of them said to me, "You can't trace that responsibility to the Pentagon. I mean, what if I crashed my father's car? Would you blame him?" So the Kurds are very, very pro-American and loyal to a fault.
Well, perhaps we'll put that 51st state thing on hold just for now then. Before we go on to the discussion, I want to thank each of the panelists for speaking so passionately and measuredly about things that are usually passionate and immoderate. You know, the name of our panel today is Under a Crescent Moon. It struck me that I wondered if we would have an equivalent panel Under a Crucifix, the changing shape of the United States, or Under the Star of David, the changing shape of Israel. Of course, on the first one, this being the LA Times Book Festival, the answer might be yes. But in general, I think we clearly have a tendency to view all that goes on in the Middle East through the lens of religion and conflict. And perhaps that is entirely appropriate and is the lens that we should. But one of the things that Kevin McKiernan's research and travels have shown is that there are other stories. I mean, this panel could perhaps as well have been titled Under a Dome, except in this case the dome would be Ski Dubai, which is a mall in the middle of Dubai with a 400-meter ski lift underneath a glass dome in which skiers in their galabias can go down past a Chico's restaurant while viewers sip beer and go off to shop nearby at La Perla. So why is it that we view this region so thoroughly through the lens of religion and conflict and not through the lens of Dubai or people throughout the region trying to make their way through the world and indeed through a free market economy with as much enthusiasm and at times despair as any other citizens of the world? Ilan, you want to start?
Sure. I'll try my hand. I think a lot of it, certainly there is a predisposition. We all know, and I can only speak from, as all of us do, from my experience. I work in Washington. I work in national security and defense planning. In that context, the Middle East is the quintessential bad neighborhood because the Middle East is a place where religion infuses politics, very often with a radical tinge that is unhealthy for opponents. And this is the context by which the United States tends to view not only problem states, such as Iran, such as Syria, such as Iraq, but unfortunately, potential allies as well. And it's to the detriment of our relations with those countries that they are seen as slightly less bad places in an overwhelmingly bad neighborhood, because I agree completely that there are gems that should be nurtured and should be cultivated in a way that not only promotes American interests and American values, but also promotes and sustains and nurtures the cultures in those countries as well.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting point. It is true, I think, that that the government does view this region as a serious problem, and probably does see that problem being, as Ilan framed it, this notion that, well, here's a place where religion and politics seem to speak as one voice, and to the detriment of our interests in that region. Well, okay, that may be true in some sense. I would say that we in the United States have really mastered the ability to speak for religion and politics to speak with one voice in that way. But if you asked a person in the Middle East, what do you think is the problem with your region? Do you think the problem, the reason for the lack of social or economic or political development in Egypt, for instance, is because of the problem with religious influence in the political realm? I think you would get a resounding no. That's because every single one of our allies in that region is an autocracy, is a secular autocracy. I guess the difference would be Saudi Arabia, though it's really kind of hard to define what kind of autocracy Saudi Arabia is. It certainly has a very serious and problematic religious ideological framework to it, though how much that framework is a part of their foreign policy, it's something to be questioned and debated. But they would say that the problem is that you have, going back to Egypt for a moment here, a very secularist, autocratic regime with a president for life who's run for office 6 times and won every election by about 96-97% of the vote. The last election was the first time in which he actually let someone run against him. Unfortunately, the person running against him had to run from prison, so it made it a little bit difficult. And yet he still managed to get, I think, 93% of the vote. Mubarak did. This is a country in which, if you are a secular-minded liberal Democrat, then you're in prison. But if you frame that language of protest, in the language of Islam, which of course is the language that holds the most currency, I think, for the masses of Arabs in that region, then you're given a free rein. This is a country in which truly the only free space in society is the mosque. And so therefore it's only natural that any kind of opposition to the status quo is going to be religious opposition. And it's actually not that surprising that that religious opposition would become radicalized in some way. So I would say that we have to, again, be wary of looking at this region solely from the American lens of what is good for us and what isn't good for us. More importantly, we need to understand what is it that this region itself wants to see as far as its own development. And let's not freak out when political or economic or social agendas in this region are framed in religious language. That is not unusual. It's not unusual there. It's not unusual here. But for some reason, if that language has a tinge of Islam to it, then the warning bells go off. But if the head of the Speaker of the House stands on the floor of Congress and calls down the wrath of God upon federal judges who disagree with him on his views on the end to life, that's normal. That's perfectly okay. That makes perfect sense. The only thing that I can say is, and this may shock people, last time I was in Iran, someone asked me, where do you live? And I said, America. And he said, what's it like living in a theocracy?
Well, I actually disagree. I think that there is a fundamental conflict here between theocracy, which I see as represented by the Islamist fundamentalist movement throughout that part of the world, and the values that we cherish in the Western world. And I think that, these are, I'm surprised that in my lifetime, these are issues that we are still battling over. Traditional societies for centuries were ruled by the dictates of one holy book or the other, or by the preeminence of one tribal group as opposed to another. And to me, the values of the Renaissance and of the history of Western Europe and of the United States cherishing freedom of expression, tolerance, a society of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, pluralistic society, are all things that I took for granted all the while that I grew up. And yet, in the time that I've spent working and reporting in the Middle East, it's very clear to me that those are battles that have not been won in these societies by any stretch. And while there are, without a doubt, a great deal more complex scenarios in any of these countries, I think it's going too far to suggest that the differences, within Iran, let's say, somehow are really no different than the issues that we face in this country. Right now, I see parallels between what's happening on this nuclear issue in Iran and what happened 25 years ago in the takeover of the American embassy. And it's precisely because I think that the mullahs feel threatened in their own country. They are, just on the basis of the fairly limited amount of time I've spent in Iran, it's clear to me that their regime, the clerical regime in Iran, is very unpopular in that country. And that was evidenced 9 years ago when they allowed basically free elections in Iran for the first time in many, many years. And reformers were elected overwhelmingly to the presidency and to the Majlis and proceeded to enact legislation that would have altered the nature of the state in Iran, would have created essentially a democracy there, would have removed the guardian council, the clerical leadership as the final authority in the country. This was, I think, a real threat to the religious regime in Iran. And there has been, without a doubt, a very strong crackdown over the past 5 or 6 years where independent newspapers that are critical of the regime have been closed down, journalists, artists, political opponents have been thrown in jail, interrogated, and all of the reformers who were elected 9 years ago were thrown out of government. They were not allowed to run. When we see Ahmadinejad as the powerless, essentially, president of that country, and we tend to think that he was popularly elected, you have to bear in mind that he was only running against candidates authorized by the clerical regime. So I think that there's an interesting story yesterday, actually, in the New York Times, an interview with Abbas Abdi, who was one of the 5 student leaders involved in planning the takeover of the American embassy 25 years ago. And this was precisely his point, that Iran is not a very stable society at the moment, that there isn't tremendous support for this regime. And I think Ahmadinejad has seized upon, as well as the clerical leadership, this nuclear issue because it rallies public support behind them. They've done the same thing that we do in this country and that every other country wants to do when they want to shore up their political position. They've created a boogeyman, a foreign enemy, an alien threat, and they are riding this thing to a measure of popularity that they didn't have 2 years ago or so. So to the extent that the United States and the UN forced this issue of nuclear energy in Iran, we are really playing into the hands, it seems to me, of Ahmadinejad and the clerical leadership, strengthening their position in the country, in the same way that the takeover of the American embassy leveraged the mullahs into power in Iran 25 years ago by doing exactly the same thing.
Well, I certainly don't believe there's a straight line between religion and resources, but I'm put in mind of an Arabic expression, an expression in Arabic: a coincidence is worth 1,000 appointments. And I say that because one of the quotes that I use in my book about the Kurds is from an undersecretary in the State Department who said, look, we wouldn't have been interested in Kuwait if they grew carrots. And I think at some point you're seeing the vectoring or the use of religion because there are other conflicts at play, and that's a useful way to posit your position to a certain extent. I'm not saying that's the entire picture, but I think it's part of that picture.
If a vicious dictator comes into power, oppresses his people, engages in numerous human rights abuses, develops a weapons program of mass destruction, threatens to use those against the West or sell them to enemies of the West and the United States, holds several hundred Americans hostage for more than 3 months, and has shown a profound willingness to take radical and drastic action to preserve his own rights and limit the power of the United States in the West. That would be Kim Jong-il of North Korea. 12 years before the Iranian hostage crisis, a U.S. gunboat ship was taken into captivity in North Korea, and its crew was held hostage for nearly 3 months. The question in the short time we have remaining is not whether Iran or radical Islam or individuals pose a threat or are manifestly antagonistic, which they are unquestionably. It is why, in a world where there are a number of such threats, that Iran and radical Islam seem to receive a level of attention and fear and concern far out of proportion to other commensurate threats throughout the world.
Well, if I was to answer that very simply, I would say what a realtor says, which is location, location, location. Mm-hmm. The Middle East is attractive because they don't grow carrots, because it's a resource-rich region.
Nor does North Korea.
No, well, that's true. They don't grow much of anything.
That's right. Exactly. Nothing. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the American involvement in the Middle East, if you look historically at the U.S. involvement, has been, I would say, a track record in which there's been more than its fair share of missteps. What I think is interesting and is profound, if you look at what this government is trying to do, in many cases it's failing, but it's trying to do, or at least trying to articulate, is the degree to which the old way of doing business no longer applies. There was a time, not too long ago, when it was standard fare, a standard modus operandi, for the U.S. government to prop up corrupt dictators, and to do so because those dictators could impose, in turn, their will on the people, to suppress the people, and to make the region better and nicer for U.S. interests. This is beginning to change. And I say beginning advisedly because quite clearly, in many places, like Egypt, for example, this remains the order of the day. But what I think is really profound is the change that's taken place in the last 2.5, 3 years, where this administration, it may not always do everything right, but the one thing that I think it's really done right conceptually is it's articulated that the old way of doing business is no longer valid, is no longer good. We should be thinking about a more profound interaction with the region. That the devil is in the details or in the implementation is quite clear every time you open the newspaper. But it's useful to recognize that there are people in this government that are beginning to reorder that relationship. But that relationship, by the way, is not just one about friendship and about a deeper friendship with the peoples of the Middle East. It's also about a deeper understanding of threats. So the roundabout answer to your question is, yes, Kim Jong-il is a threat. But North Korea is basically an island. North Korea has very limited ability to project its hostility abroad.
Kim Jong-ilism isn't about to break out all over the world.
Exactly. And Kim Jong-il is not sitting astride an ideology that espouses a clash of, if not civilizations, then cultures, the way the current Iranian president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, quite clearly is. And I think this is a profound point, because we're talking about Iran now. We could not have had this discussion a year ago. The Iranian president, because of his rhetoric and his brinksmanship on the nuclear issue, has really galvanized attention to this. But if you were to look at the core foundational documents of North Korea or of the Islamic Republic, you'll realize, and I'm talking about Islamic government by the Ayatollah Khomeini, among other documents, you'll realize that there is a profound discussion that needs to be had about not simply relationships within regimes, but about how we relate to those regimes based on their character.
Mark, to continue this, you've spent a lot of time in Latin America. What if that were Hugo Chavez in a few years, sitting on top of the largest reserves of oil, who's clearly antagonistic toward the United States, has an ideology that is appealing throughout Latin America, and could conceivably, and I'm sure would want to develop weapons of mass destruction?
And so the question is,
why would we then focus as much on that as we currently focus on Iran?
Yes, I mean, I think that the sort of the leftist socialist movements in South America and Central America are a mounting problem for the United States. The existence of oil in Venezuela is a complicating factor. Oil is a very legitimate an important resource in the Western world, in the world at large. We would be in one hell of a fix as a nation, and in the international community would be in one hell of a fix if a politically or religiously governed regime were to restrict access to a vital resource. So I think it's a legitimate concern. Our need to be able to purchase oil at a fair market price. And so, it has that potential, yes.
We are at the witching hour. Just a final thought as we go, and I'm sorry we didn't get a chance for questions. I appreciate that. It's not my call in this case.
I don't have anywhere to be.
I don't make the rules. I enforce them. These people need to get to the South signing area to sign and sell books.
As a valedictory comment, and I'm sorry again, take it up with management. I mean, I'm sorry. There are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world and 500 million people in the Middle East, and we do tend to focus on conflict. I think that's human nature. I don't think there's anything particularly dark or devious about it. But as we go forth into the next years, as we will inevitably, as these things continue to be flashpoints of tension, let's remember that there are hundreds of millions of people trying to live their lives daily as honorably as they can, raise and feed their families, who are as uninterested in these conflicts as most of us hopefully will be years from now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more information on the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, visit latimes.com/Festival of Books.